I want to welcome everybody. I'm really excited to see such a great crowd today, to come out and welcome Dr. Nalova Lyonga, who has traveled a very long way to be with us from the University of Buea in Cameroon. I'm Laura Henghold. I'm director of the French and Francophone Studies program and associate professor in philosophy. And I want to say just a couple of words about how this project came about. About 3 years ago, Marie Lathers in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures proposed a project to create a 3-week study abroad course for students at CASE to be able to travel to Cameroon the way they had been traveling to Paris to also study the French language, in Montreal to do the service learning project. And she got a Presidential Initiative Fund grant to travel with Cheryl Thoman and a colleague and fellow writer from Cameroon and Paris, Therese Kuo-Makori. And I tagged along, basically. I said that I'd like to do a course in African philosophy, and I wanted to meet with some African philosophers. And so we all went over on a site visit to see where it would be best to do this program, the 3-week course. And we ended up basically choosing Dr. Lyonga's university, the University of Buea in Cameroon. Then to follow up and to continue intensifying the relationship, we got a McGregor Worldwide Learning Environment Fund this year in order to bring her here from Cameroon, in order to conduct teleconferences, which we did very successfully last week and will do so in the future, and also to talk about, to have her meet people here and to have conversations in classes. Dr. Lyonga is professor of English at the University of Buea in Cameroon. She's co-editor of Anglophone Cameroon Writing and editor of Socrates in Cameroon, The Life and Works of Bernard Fonlon. She's also author of numerous articles on feminist theory and literature in African countries. She's an expert on the relation of language to ethnic and gender identity. In her administrative roles, she's director of academic affairs, deputy vice chancellor in charge of teaching, Deputy Vice Chancellor, also in charge of professionalization and the development of information and communication technologies, which is why she's so well suited to come here and help us learn how to do long distance conversations between Cameroon and the United States. So I would like to thank Dr. Lyonga for coming here today. I'd also like to thank very much my counterparts and my colleagues in the French and Francophone Studies program, Gilbert Doho, Director of Ethnic Studies, Cheryl Thoman, who has put up with my various frustrations and anxieties over the last couple weeks as we got this thing in action, Molly Berger, who has been tremendously supportive from the Dean's office, Marie Lathers, who got this whole thing in motion and will be going to Cameroon to live next year on a Fulbright, Tom Nab from the College of Arts and Sciences, who actually got the video conference technology working, and Renee Agnew, the department assistant in philosophy, who has been tremendously patient, helpful, and supportive as we've brought this process to fruition. So I invite you to enjoy the talk. The talk is Walking a Tightrope, Gender Interrelations in African Societies. We are filming this, and so it will go on CASE TV. Anybody who wants to refer to it later will have the opportunity to do so. And without further ado, I introduce Dr. Lyonga.
Let me begin by expressing my pleasure and privilege to address you. In this respect, I want to acknowledge my colleagues of CASE, the administrators, for inviting me to visit CASE and for the sponsorship of some invaluable activities that we have carried out since I arrived here on the 31st. In particular, I want to thank Professors Laura Henghold and Cheryl Thomas, my brother compatriot, Monsieur le Professeur Gilbert Doho, and the very creative Renee. I'll go right away now by inviting the audience to just take a moment and look through the outline of this afternoon's lecture, whose title you can see. I'll take recourse to a personal narrative as the starting point. I'm going to start from the very familiar premise, which is my own background, my own family. I came to this subject on gender interrelations, from what I observed of my family and my clan, my people are called the Bakweri. The Bakweri are people found in Boya, in the southwest province of Cameroon, in Limbe. They speak a language called Mokwe, a word which has been anglicized to Bakweri. I was born into a family of 3 children, and these 3 children were 2 girls and a boy. The boy is an albino, and according to some of the traditions in Cameroon, an albino is not even considered to be a full human being. And as you may know, in some cultures, the girls or the girl child is not considered to be a very desirable person to have, especially because people are looking for heirs, for the male heir. 3 children, 2 girls, 1 boy, an albino, meant a child desert. There were not enough children in the African sense of the family. And so a second marriage was contracted. This second marriage was not such a remarkable solution after all, because in total, my father had 10 children, 9 girls and 1 boy. So he had 13 children, 2 boys. What does a father who has 11 daughters do in a tradition that favors boys? Do you wait for the boy to grow up so that you can groom him, since the girls are the seniors? To cut a long story short, I would like to give credit to my father. And I think the audience can answer the question that I just posed. When you have 11 daughters, do you keep the daughter's future on hold while you wait to bring up the male heir? Now, in the same tradition, there is also, in one way, the valuation of a female child, for it is believed that without a female child, the family would not grow. That's an obvious observation. But this valuation is mostly on the mother's side, on the maternal side, because there is a tradition of matrilineage. All the children belong to the mother's side. And so, when we would have our meetings, it would be the children of my mother and her sister, etc. And what this also means is that my brother's children will not belong to our family, quote unquote, but would belong to the family of their mother, matrilineage. Now, what this means is that in my tradition, matrilineality and patrilineality run parallelly. But under the hierarchy of patriarchy, The question is, who has the responsibility of upholding each one? Would the husband promote matrilineage on behalf of their wives? Who would promote women or women's concerns? Is it men or is it women? As a child, I was never able to understand all the fuss of my grandmother, my maternal aunts and uncles over this tradition that identified the lineage. Would wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning in order to go back to the village and perform the rites that solidified that lineage. And I never really understood the whole force, as I said. That tradition is called Irowate in my language, or a loose translation, all of us. I'd like also to underline this point from the grandmother's side. It was from my paternal grandmother that I learned the strategy of naming. For you may know that to name a child is a very, very significant action because it is believed the child's character is linked to the person for whom he or she is named. It's a memory gimmick, but it is also a projection of a character you would like your child to emulate. And so, naming is a method of writing, say, an act of prescription on the child. This method was exploited by my grandmother, who, among her children, named one after her. My father was known as Ngeka Mojoko, the child, Ngeke, the child of Mojoko. My mother's name was Mojoko. My father's older brother, the eldest, was Peter Lyonga. There was subversion, but also accession of a male tradition. And if one may use Spivak here, can a subaltern speak? Yes, this was a subaltern text, and it was giving a message. That name, Ngeka Mojoko, endured until birth certificates and identity cards came in, and marriage certificates, etc., all of those, helping to establish surnames and middle names and first names. And so it stabilized to Ngeka Lyonga, and the name Mojoko was erased. This is all the story of colonization. In the village, my mother is known as Liangula Kobi and not Mrs. Lyonga. In the tradition, marriage did not change the name of the woman. After all, you're named just once, but you could marry multiple times. And so Africans stabilized this, had a way of identifying the woman with those names. In the modern tradition, my mother is called Mrs. Elizabeth Lyonga, but if you go to the village, nobody will know her as Mrs. Elizabeth Lyonga. You have to say Elira Kobe. I remember that the research that we're doing with one of my colleagues, among the Bangante, they also have the Ndap, which is a praise name among the Bangante in the Western Province, and is the special name that is used to identify the family where you come from, where the woman comes from, since they believe that the women are always going around getting married to different people in different places. And therefore, there is one way of identifying where you came from. Now, I'd like to say, if I can summarize the selected features that come from my family. You know, you have a family of 3, eventually 13, a lone boy, an albino, eventually 2, and both boys, the last born. From my grandma's legacy, considerable independence, the dichotomy of space was not pronounced except in socio-religious and political terms, but not so in economic terms. Hence, the public-private debate, the male breadwinner were issues of no consequence. Once my father got married to my mother, she could not do business. My father thought it was an insult for her to start a business because she was the wife of a man working as director in a corporation, the CDC. How could you go to town? She had what is called an off license. And she would actually go there, despite the fact that she had people working under her. She would go there herself, install herself in the off license, and do some of the selling herself. And this was not too good for the class image that my father had already adopted. And as I said earlier, the self-inscription, you know, the fact of being able to name yourself. And if I could put this in the modern context of feminism, I could simply refer to Mary Daly's Beyond the Godfather. The act of being able to name something is an empowering one. Now let me move from my background to a literary paradigm that tries to demonstrate these gender relations. And I'm going to use Things Fall Apart, which is the most well-known African novel worldwide. It is also the best in dramatizing the dialectical relationships of female and male principles, their ramifications on social institutions and individual psyche. There is, in that novel, a god, male, called Idemili, and a goddess, earth goddess. There is a male crime and a female crime. There is fatherland and motherland. These are examples of the male and female principles that operate in this society and which Chinua Achebe was able to reflect in the novel Things Fall Apart. Now, but then in that novel, he has a hero who spends a lifetime trying to contradict or violate the female principle. As you can see on the board, it gives you, that quote gives you an insight into how Okonkwo came about, spending his life going against a principle of balance which had been well established in that society from the time he saw his father and found that his father loved music, loved the flute, he was soft, etc. And those were called weak attributes, and attributes that could not be identified or associated with being masculine. And so, as you can see in the quote, somebody had called him by the name Agbala, a name which meant woman. And this was insulting to Okonkwo. That was how Okonkwo first came to know that Agbala was not only another name for woman, but that it could also mean a man who had no title. And so he had one passion: to hate everything that his father had loved. Next one. If you look at the next slide, you're going to find that to understand what is happening in Things Fall Apart, you have to do a little bit of deconstruction here. And you can see that Agbala means man. Unfortunately for Chinua Achebe, he used writing, and writing tended to stabilize these meanings. Now, if you say in oral tradition, agbala, agbala, there is no difference, isn't there? When you write, an agbala male god is in capital letters, and agbala, the undercase A, means woman, then you have actually established a hierarchy and a devaluation of the female principle, or what Derrida calls a deferred meaning. So I'm reading this using Derrida. Now, the important thing that happens here is that Okonkwo does not succeed. Big tragedy. A man who had achieved the highest title in that land finally ends up committing suicide because he would not accept the new religion, the new culture of the West that was coming in. But at the same time, things were changing in that culture. He had a passion just for one gender. And that violation of balance cost him his life. He committed suicide, and Okonkwo had to be buried in the forest. The same forest which he had denied when he was exiled to his motherland. He called it the bush. And now he died in the bush. And because he had committed suicide, he could not be given the burial of a nobleman. And this is what is underlined by Okonkwo's fate, is the fact that you should not violate balance, particularly in a culture which is dual sex. I would like to also, while I go to that, for the deconstruction, to suggest that between Agbala, capital A, and Agbala, undercase A, one cannot understand the meaning of the other without the meaning of one without the other. In order for man, if I take another example, in order for man, just the word M-A-N, to have meaning, you need both the consonants and the vowel A to make a meaning. This means that you're talking about presence emphasized by absence. And it also means that you cannot infer inferiority to the deferred meaning. But that is what Okonkwo did. And therefore, in this situation, there should be no inference of equality. Just the being of both is very important. Presence emphasized by deferral. Perhaps if one uses George A. Kelly's description, it may be clearer. Kelly talks about, in discussing duality, he says, we consider the contrasting end of a construct to be both relevant and necessary to the meaning of the construct. Let me also recall here that duality is a basic principle of life. And I'll borrow from Saba Karam as he investigates duality in the sciences. And he states that the duality principle characterized several of the laws and operations found in almost all areas of study labeled as science. Duality is also a principle observed in the humanities. Terms like complementarity, dialectical, opposite, or inverse are sometimes used to indicate the idea of dualism. Dualism is oftentimes used to refer to two opposing forces, two operations, or two characteristics. The dual pairs might be observed functioning alone in a given phenomenon, but more frequently can be distinguished and separated and labeled with their distinct properties. Other times, the two distinct elements act in such close proximity that they cannot be distinguished. I want to carry Karam's point even further by seeing how he recalls the application of duality to our daily lives. Now, he says, the idea of integrating the disciplines around a model of common good, social concerns, and personal development focuses on the human problems created as a result of the extremes to which mankind has gravitated in the use and manipulation of his power. Monopolies, slavery, pollution, ethnic cleansing, narcissism, poverty, nuclear intimidation, prejudice, and abuse of power and wealth are the excesses of human nature. In order to counterbalance a tendency towards these extremes, a view of science is needed, which alerts us to the boundaries beyond which, if we trespass, leads to these same abuses. A view of science based on the concept of duality would indeed accommodate Professor Hurd's common good model in a natural and humanistic way. Extreme modes of operation within the social realm should be analyzed within the context of the extremes of forces in the natural realm. A balance occurs between the extremes. Let me now demonstrate duality in the societies. And I'm going to begin from Nigeria with the Onitsha, who have dual monarchies, namely the Omu, female, and the Obi, male. You're just going to permit me to read from Nkuru's book, Feminist Concepts in African Philosophy of Culture, and I'm looking at page 221 of that. Now she says, prior to 1886, the Ikoro Onitsha, Council of Women of Onitsha, had the Omu as its leader. As was the case in Opankwa and Agbo, the Onitsha political structure had two monarchs, the Obi, male, and the Omu, female. The Omu, along with her council of Otuogene, was the head of the female side of the national administration. They complemented the role and duties of the male administrative side, represented by the Obi and the Ndiche at the apex. With her council, the Otuogene, the Omu represented the interests of the nation of Onitsha in trade, economic matters, and certain political, social, and spiritual functions, as well as the interests of women. The Obi did the same with Ndiche in the male sphere of authority. Balance, that is the key word. Balance and the search for a model of common good. Let us now move to the anthropologists and take a look at anthropological evidence of bipolarity. Just a quick sampling of masks from the Tikari in the northwest province of Cameroon. You're going to see That's a male stool of royal power. From the Tikari, now we are in Cameroon. I've left Nigeria. Tikari Bamenda in Cameroon. Let's move to the next one. That's the female stool of royal power in Tikari amongst the Bamenda in Cameroon. That's another male stool of royal power. And that is the bigender enthronement stool for the transmission of the power of governance from the woman to the man. And I should let you know that it is always the woman that does the enthronement. Here you have the Tikari, the male counterpart of the vital forces of creation and fertility. Let's move to the next one. And another, the female counterpart, who is always a woman and is always the leader of the Kungang society. Let's see the anthropologist. Okay. Now these pictures come thanks to the anthropologist, Dr. Fungot Kinney, a member of staff of the Department of Women and Gender Studies, who is the owner and curator of the museum from where I have shown you those samples. I just want to read just one quote as Dr. Kinney lets us understand the philosophy of female power. This is just one instance, and this has to do with the shedding of blood, particularly where the leader has been condemned for one problem or the other, for one crime or the other. And the person who does the execution, the chief executioner, is always the Mafo Kungang. That's a woman, and I quote, because it is physically understood that only the woman has the right to take life, because she alone gives birth to life in the natural world. The woman alone can pour ritual blood because she alone pours the ritual blood of the moon cycle of regeneration and recreation. For it is believed that it is at birthing that the woman transmits the ritual blood of regeneration, recreation, reproduction, and creativity to her children through the bloodstream of her uterus and the umbilical cord. And if I go back to feminist theory, this is very close to Adrienne Rich's concept of woman born. Let's leave the anthropologist to rest for a minute, because the book from which this comes is so rich, and you have so many examples showing you the woman as the founder of a family. Even for tribes, warrior tribes, such as the Lyonga, and famous festivals as the Lela are all held to commemorate the contribution of this woman who brought tribes from Nigeria, moving down, conquering other tribes, and settling in Lyonga in the northwest province of Cameroon. Now, I'd like to say that all of this power was in jeopardy with the arrival of colonization and even post-colonialism. To demonstrate this, I'm going to read a song from my brother compatriot's book, Poésie et lutte de libération au Cameroun. Gilbert, il faut m'excuser hein, parce que j'ai laissé les... Je n'ai pas mis les accents. J'ai oublié de changer le dictionnaire. And one of the songs says, the thing about, as we said, most of the literature is oral. And songs occupy a very special place in the tradition because these are things that were actually used, not just, they were sung by the people. It's not just fictional. And this is coming out of a very delicate period of Cameroon's history, a period when most of the leaders of independence were characterized as killers, as maquisards, as communists, so that with the Cold War, they could be smoked out once you classify them as communists. Now, this song also shows you how you devalue a population, and particularly the women. And let me just say, I'm sorry it's in French, ce fut l'an 1952 que le représentant du Cameroun se rendit à l'ONU. À cette occasion, on lui posa la suivante question. N'y a-t-il pas de femmes au Cameroun? Le représentant français à l'ONU répondit et dit, nous vous avons dit qu'ils sont encore tout petits pour accéder à la souveraineté nationale. Leurs femmes ne savent ni faire la lessive, ni faire la toilette de leurs enfants. Ainsi, l'indépendance qu'ils revendiquent ne convient pas à leur pays. Cette indépendance ne sera jamais. Le représentant du Cameroun rétorqua en disant que le pays regorge de femmes instruites, qualifiées dans beaucoup de métiers, d'autres sont spécialisées dans l'enseignement. Donnez-moi, dit-il, une autre occasion, je reviendrai à coup sûr avec certaines d'entre elles, et à coup sûr, vous verrez vous-même. Elles parlent elles-mêmes. Elles vous exposeront leurs doléances. Et à coup sûr, vous constaterez vous-même le niveau intellectuel du Cameroun. Ainsi, notre pays doit avoir son indépendance, car nous méritons cette independence. In a nutshell, you can find, for them, it's almost a dialogue between the representative of Cameroon and the French representative. And the French representative said, I have told you these people are little children. They cannot do anything. The women don't know anything. They cannot even wash clothes. They cannot even wash their own, they cannot even wash their own children. Therefore, he says, the independence that they are looking for, they do not merit it. They cannot have independence. Now, that is how colonialism and post-colonialism systematically erodes female power and self-representation. There is also the historical event of the women of the Igbo women who had waged war in 1926 against the colonial administration. And in writing about that, the authors called it Aba riots. And Okonjo, from an African perspective, has the title where it is asked, Aba riots or Igbo women's war? These are women who went against the imposition of taxes, and they were able to bring about a major transformation. And the point is that when traditional women are at war, it is not a joke. I should indicate here that in Cameroon, during the 90s, when there was a clamor for multi-partyism, it was the women's clan, the Takambeng, who protected the leader of the opposition. Now, what is happening here is that one is saying, in such cultures, woman as the adjudicator, the keeper of peace, of justice, of administration, advocacy, the interventionist. And the point is that in these cultures, the women must walk a tightrope between being a woman and keeping those characteristics that may be looked at as being adversarial to the man, but rather in complementarity with those other characteristics. Now I'm going to do my proposition, and it comes by way of a challenge. The University of Buea is one of the first institutions in Central Africa, perhaps in Africa at the time. We couldn't find any other university that had a full-fledged Department of Women and Gender Studies. But as soon as we started the university in 1993, the thing that we decided was that there had to be a Department of Women and Gender Studies. And come next fall, we shall begin the PhD in gender and development. I think that issues of female power, leadership patterns, the scholarization of female knowledge cannot but be the concern of such a department. For we have laws, we have the heritage. What you have just seen, what my whole talk has just been to give you, the heritage. You have a population of women who are 51%, the majority in the country. Their economic participation is so high, excluding, of course, multinational and other supermarket chains. But politicization, very low, despite the fact that the heritage shows a very great emphasis on women's participation in politics. And today we know that there are so many fathers who have daughters, and these fathers are challenged by the male privileging ethos because they are charmed by the enterprising acumen of their daughters. I'm one example. Perhaps in default of male heirs, I'm the next of kin in my family. What one can say is that at some point, this system is bound to implode. The heritage that I have just laid out must increasingly find its way in the curriculum or in the curricula of schools from primary to tertiary, and, very importantly, the community. At the University of Buea, the Department of Women and Gender Studies already has the students have an association, the Association for the Improvement of the Status of Cameroon Women, ISCAO. And the boys, now talking to my colleagues with whom we did the video conferencing, some of the men, the boys, the students, the undergraduates who were talking at that video conference are students of the Department of Women and Gender Studies who belong to ice cow. It is a significant arm of outreach. The legacy of our heritage has strengths and, do not misconstrue, and weaknesses, definitely. Academia, in collaboration with the communities, have to develop more adequate ways of shaping leadership. Conclusion. I want to totally agree with Ntiru, whom I read earlier, when she says that in a context where power and rights are distributed on the basis of duties, mutual respect develops between the sexes if these duties are performed in a satisfactory way. Women's and men's views are deemed critical, both because of the work they do and the special insights they bring to the running of the society. In this nurturing environment, both are their own persons, and women are unaccustomed to men's making decisions for them. In political matters, each group has a strong political voice, and it is as groups that people make and enforce political decisions. Zegu has spoken of a trimodal state of action, where the two councils and constituencies came together in conference sessions to address issues at a supranational level. Now, this coincides, the trimodal model coincides with Francisco Varela's point, coming from the biologist's perspective on complementarity and knowledge, and for whom Trinity means the contemplation of ways in which pairs, poles, extremes, modes, sides, etc., are related and yet remain distinct. The way they are not one, and I love this, the way they are not one, not two. We are challenged to reconstruct the modalities of changed leadership patterns in the 21st century, be it in Cameroon or the global context. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thanks very much, Dr. Lyonga. Absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure that everybody's got questions and we have time for a few, so please think up things to ask. This is a rare opportunity. Yes?
Can you say a little bit about the scholarization of female knowledge that you mentioned? Like, what exactly does that mean?
That means simply that you have to raise what the women in the rural areas are doing and bring it into academic discourse. So that, how would you do that? That is the challenge. And what I'm saying is that if you have a Department of Women and Gender Studies, you have a university that does that, that is the challenge. You have to find ways of doing it. Here is a heritage of how women have done it, right? You don't need to invent the wheel from scratch, but you need to understand how they did it and to adapt that to modern realities. We have to do it. We cannot ignore it. We can't behave as if it has not happened. And it has been happening even of recent. This is not in history. It's not just 1926. I'm talking last year when the women of Babanki were able to depose a male ruler. And it was the rural women, not the urban women, who did it. The methods are different.
Because it seems to be such a rigid structure.
What is rigid?
People incorporating like service learning into current academia? Maybe I'm speaking more from the US perspective, but I would just think it's challenging to do that.
Through research, through sensitization, through conferences, you know, there are all sorts of ways, and we have to begin talking about these things. I think what Case and Yubi did just last week is already, that's a reflection of what is needed, because a video conference was on women's constituencies. How do you build a constituency when you have constituencies? You know, there are differences, you know, but you don't fold your arms. You know the knowledge is there. You have to use the knowledge in the present times.
I think I heard you say that academia has to develop better ways of shaping leadership. If you said that, what do you mean by shaping leadership, and leadership for what?
Yeah. Now, what I mean by this is that what exists in the traditional legacy has shown us where you have women and men leading. Okay? So you have a male leader and you have two women. Or in other contexts, one woman and two men. So you have three people who are running the show. In one of the other countries in Tikari, you know, the male is enthroned and the sister is also enthroned at the same time. You know, so it is not a monosex kind of thing, but you know, you have all these other people coming together to think of the way in which society can move ahead. You know, is it doable? Is it not doable? Again, I keep saying there are challenges, but this is it. You know, the tradition shows that it is not one person at the head. You know, what are the benefits of that? One needs to look at it.
That sounds very similar to what I think people call distributed leadership in the environment in which I work.
They call what? Excuse me?
Distributed leadership.
Distributed. Okay.
Duality seems to be hermeneutically ambiguous. Duality may be assumed to mean equality in all dimensions of power and authority. That is a fairly straightforward notion of duality. Duality also can be understood as recognition as equal with a division of functions. That's a slightly different notion of duality. Another possible notion of duality is dialectical opposition, which is productive of synthesis. Now, if we opt for the third interpretation of duality, that is, the actual power relations may change through time. Mm-hmm. What remains is that the dialectical tension. Mm-hmm. Now, there is an interesting notion. In fact, one might argue that given duality of the third kind, there emerges a third. Duality eventuates in trinity. For example, think of the opposition between male privileges and women's rights. Out of the dialectical discourse about these, there will emerge renewed, reinterpreted notion of human rights. The human rights do not belong to the male or to the female. It belongs to the synthesis, if I may use that expression.
To the human society.
That is correct. So I guess my question is, what do you mean by duality? That is, I mean, what aspects of duality do you stress?
Yeah, okay. Now, I did say that you're not talking about equality in the sense of, you know, having every level duplicated, but you're talking about complementarity, you know, where people are doing different things, and sometimes if they're doing the same things but for different ends, you know, in that sense, there is equality, but it's asymmetrical, all right? And so that's how the dual sex works. In fact, Okonjo talks about equality but asymmetrical relationships. So that's what it is. And of course, you're coming back to the Trinity thing, because what I propose is that, or what even the literature would be talking about, is that when you have two opposites coming together, they unify to move ahead, to move the equation ahead for a stronger outcome. And that is it. And that's why the Trinity is so important. It is not one, as in Western Trinity. It is not two. But there is something else that comes out of this, and that's what we're looking for. Whatever Trinity you use, let it be that the outcome is the moving forward. It's moving us forward to something else.
Probably it's just a comment, because the way you presented it and the way you also talked about duality, it made me really understand my own little kingdom, the Fulda kingdom, which is patriarchal. But in reality, it's not patriarchal. If I really understand that, because the king can never be enthroned without overcoming many obstacles. And among these obstacles is the fact that he must prove that he can generate, he can bring children. So without a woman, a king can never be enthroned. That's why when the king is initiated in what we call lakam or novitiate, one would say, he never goes alone to be initiated to become a king. On the contrary, he goes with many women, and that's where we see the tricky patriarchal aspect of it, bringing women behind. He goes to the initiation with many women, and the rule of these women is to enable him to have the son, or no, not the son, to have the child without him, which he can never be enthroned as a king. So in that society, we say all the power belongs to man, but in reality, the power also belongs to the woman. Because if the woman doesn't give that child, there will not be enthronement at all. It's just coming.
Thank you very much. And the thing is that, what we need to understand here is that there is such variety in the African cultures, when it comes to patterns of leadership and the procedures. And it is just time that we look into the question of leadership to come up with something that would make the present even better than what we know now.
I was just wondering if you're implying that the power differential that exists today, or the oppression of women that exists today, originated with colonialism, or there are some continuities between traditional power structures and today?
Oh, no, not at all. That it was reinforced. Colonialism, post-colonialism, those practices reinforced whatever prejudice there was in African traditions. The thing is that human beings have the tendency to go to the extreme. And it's very easy. It's very, very easy to do the negative things sometimes than to do the good things, the positive things. And so you have a culture that says more men, a male heir, etc. And then you have a Western system that comes and says, well, education is for the male child. The girl child can go to school, but you'll have to do domestic science and some other things, the subjects are arranged in such a way that you know what the sphere for the female child is and what it is for the male child. When you have those two meet, then there is a reinforcement of the negative. And that's why I'm saying that there is the heritage, but we must be selective in those things that we use to come out with the Trinity, with the third level.
I was wondering how you discuss U.S. gender relations in your department classes.
Does my department, she says, does my department discuss gender relations in the United States? And if so, how do they present them? I don't know whether I should delve into this. I don't know if I should delve into this. Now, certainly we don't have a course. We have not designed a course for that. You know, there are seminars where we can do various topics, but unofficially, we do talk about it. And if you were, perhaps you went there for the video conference, in fact, the Clinton-Obama thing came up naturally in such a discussion, you know. We discuss it inadvertently when we talk about the West. And of course, you begin with feminist theories in the West, you know, because you have to begin with the premise where at the beginning, people thought by virtue of the fact that you are a woman, you will immediately get onto the bandwagon of feminism, you know. That's how optimistic women were in the 60s, forgetting that there would be blacks, there would be Latinos, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so we do, yes, we do discuss this indirectly. As you can see, I'm deliberately trying not to talk about Clinton and Barack.
One of the things I noticed when you were talking about the importance of duality coming together and the formation of the Trinity to go forward was that it brought to my mind the Western tradition of duality, looking at the Nietzschean duality, like the absolute good versus absolute evil, is conceptualized in terms of mutually exclusive competitive forces rather than the complementary and cooperative forces that you're talking about. Do you think that Western ontological tradition had any bearing on what happened after colonization?
Yes, I think that was more of it, you know, and that is coming from a monosex system, you know, as opposed to a dual sex system, you know, and of course, who is it? Is it Lucy Irigaray? I can't remember now. Who does the, you know, who does the concept of phallogocentricity? The phallus, the logo, the word, you know. So the woman up, the man down, you know, and she talks day on the one hand, night on the other hand, you know, these oppositions, binary oppositions, you know, and that shows that that is where that philosophy is coming from, you know, and what we're saying is that, you know, other people have other ways of doing that. You know, that Lucy Irigaray phallogocentricity, you can read that from New French Feminisms, which has, it's an anthology of various views.
Language. Languages work, and how do you address the variety of the English, French, etc.
Yeah. French makes it even difficult because French has feminine and masculine, right? You speak French?
A little bit.
Yeah.
I speak Spanish, which also has masculine.
Has words that use that are feminine and words that are masculine. N'est-ce pas, Gilbert? Mais tu veux dire quelque chose sur ça?
From language perspective, when you take French and English, you have genre and garçon, but you also have the other side, word specific for une fille. So you have genre féminin, you have genre masculin, féminin, masculin. The language, the way the language functions, you see this opposition genre from, you know, even the sound, you already feel it. You see the division. Now, whereas in some matriarchal, in some languages in Cameroon, that opposition doesn't come up like this. That's why you have the word Agbala. Agbala. It's a word that is used, but that word, depending on how you use it, can mean a woman or it can mean man. So that division does not function in terms of languages in other ways, which still sustain this idea of that when this society they develop themselves, this division between man and woman, the dominating power of man and the dominating power of women, it didn't exist, and the language show it actually. It was as the society move ahead, that man become trying to accept and pushing woman ahead and behind. And the colonial system really came, and I thank you honestly. I didn't understand that poem from that perspective. That poem that I just reproduced that poem like that, where you see that the representative of the French system in Cameroon says, oh, they cannot have independence. Let me just give you one example. Women do not know anything at all. No, they are backward. So we cannot give them independence. But the representative of Cameroon say, no, that's a lie. Let me bring you women of Cameroon here. That was in UN here. And then you see that these women are capable of representing themselves, talking about themselves. And believe me, the war of liberation in Cameroon wasn't only the question of man, it was the question of women. That's so right. In languages, in French, for instance, you see that division. Whereas in some of the languages in Cameroon, 250 languages, you see some where you don't have that division.
Mm-hmm. So my question was along those lines you just mentioned. In your experience with your own language, or if I could describe it as your maternal language or the languages you grew up speaking, and how the other languages, French and English, what is the relationship or the alignments, the power, the structures, etc., that are connected to the different languages, if any?
I don't think that I can make a connection, because in my language, for instance, when you say mola nongo, usually when a woman has done something really significant, including standing her grounds against a male, they say mola nongo. That is a woman. That mola nongo does not connote weakness. Nothing of the sort. But it gives attributes that either gender, either sex could have. You see? So, and when you come to Western languages, see, there's no logic that makes me say, say for instance, une table, as opposed to un chapeau. Why is one feminine and one masculine? In my language, a table is, teli. That's it. There's no article before that. So this just goes to show, there's a lot of research on this, and that's why I like the phallogocentrism, because it does emphasize the place of language in entrenching some of these inequalities.
Thank our speaker, and everybody have a